I mean, the Russia and China relationship, I think, is one of the most important ones in the international world today. And before the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, they famously met and announced that they had a partnership without limits. I mean, the Ukraine war, I think, has shown that there are substantial limits on this partnership, but nonetheless it is a very important one. And it's not simply a recent one also. I mean, in many ways, it's emerged over 3 decades. The roots of the relationship already started with a reset under President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, and we saw an effort to really try and rebuild a very difficult relationship along the Russia-China border, and that, I think, is the foundation of the current strategic partnership, has been this trust that has been built in terms of managing that border. And then it's obviously expanded, and the central core of it is really an anti-US position, an anti-Western policy in which both Russia and China have a shared interest in trying to weaken the US role globally, and particularly the US role in Europe and other parts of the world. And so they're able to cooperate on that, and we've seen cooperation recently on expanding the BRICS, with the BRICS summit in South Africa, the enlargement of that. And so where that agenda plays out, the two are very close, so in multilateral institutions. Where it's less effective is when you actually start to go into regional issues. And so the Ukraine war, I think, is a case in point in which China has found itself in a very difficult position, because actually the war is harming its interests in Europe, its interests in broader economic issues, but it nonetheless has to support Russia in that. So the relationship is under strain. It's also evolving. Russia is becoming more dependent on China, and part of the partnership works because China has to flatter Russia to some degree. I mean, it's not an equal partnership anymore. China is so much more powerful, but it mustn't really be seen to be the big brother. Otherwise, of course, it won't work from the Russian perspective. So I think it's emerging as this coincidence of interests in some areas and a deepening partnership, but I wouldn't yet say it's a fully strategic partnership. And you can see that, for example, there's not interoperability in military issues, as, for example, there is in the NATO side. Intelligence sharing there's still a deep lack of trust, I think, ultimately between Russia and China about some of those key questions. So, I mean, the Ukraine war, I think, has been the main driver of the relationship, in which Russia has looked to try and pull China into the war to some degree. It's certainly asked for military assistance. It's looked to China to support it politically, and there has been some efforts around things like the recent G20 process, in which Russia and China have been working to make sure that the diplomatic language is not critical of Russia's war against Ukraine. But China has been reluctant, I think, to get too fully involved for a number of reasons. One is because there is a threat of major sanctions on China from the US and Europeans and others if Western countries detect that China is providing military support for Russia. So Russia has actually turned more to North Korea than to China for some of this stuff. And secondly, because China has tried to present itself as a mediator in the Ukraine conflict, but most people understand that's not the case, and so actually its position has become quite a complicated one. It's set out its own peace plan, but it looks like it's really on one side of the conflict. So China's had to take a difficult position in trying to present itself as being neutral, but in fact not being neutral in its actions. Yeah, I mean, the last year in the war has shown that the relationship is changing, that the two are moving closer, but it is this asymmetric relationship in which Russia's having to give more to China than China is giving to Russia because of that. And so economically and from a resource supply point of view, Russia is supplying a lot more to China than it was before the war. There's some suggestion that Russia may have to relax its efforts to stop China entering the Arctic on Russia's terms, so that China will have better access to Arctic resources along the Russian coast. And thirdly, that China is gradually extending its presence across Eurasia. Central Asia is often the focus, but we've seen with the strategic partnership with Georgia that China has bigger ambitions than just Central Asia. It wants to open up many other parts. So I think one of the core questions is how Russia and China manage this relationship in Eurasia. The big geopolitical struggle in the world is the Western powers, led by the US, are taking historically a maritime focus. They focused on control of the high seas and access to the areas around the big oceans. And so the US and Japanese concept of the Indo-Pacific is a maritime concept. The Russian and Chinese are promoting a sort of Eurasian-centric vision of the world in which they would dominate the Eurasian landmass. So that partnership is going to be fundamental to that project, but the Russian and Chinese versions of that are not yet fully in sync. And I think to me one of the core issues is going to be, can Russia and China find an accommodation in which China becomes more and more of a key player in Eurasia because its economic power is so much greater than Russia's. It's going to become a much larger actor. It's going to reshape the Eurasian economic order through its transport and trade and energy policies. It's already doing that. And Russia's going to have to accept it's a second order actor, at least in those areas, in that partnership. At the moment, Russia has to do that because it needs China, but of course there may be difficulties in the future if they can't manage that relationship.